Good morning, everybody. Thank you for coming out. I'm glad we have such a good and alert-looking crowd on a Saturday. We were supposed to let you sleep in, but we did this instead. So I'm Linda Portal. I'm Community Development Director here, and we've got several of our staff members and our friends from the consulting planning group who are helping us out to address the really kind of the land use in most of the city. We'll have to actually look at the land use in all of the city eventually as we go through our comp planning process. But the primary purpose here today is to talk about discrepancies between our plan and the county and what our options are to bring them into compliance with each other, just to make sure everything's consistent. This is Alan Steinbeck. We have Mary Weber. They are with our planning consulting group, and Jenny Rowan is in the back. She's the planning coordinator, and there's other folks around all over the place. So Bob Daniels is in the back, and the mayor and our vice mayor are here. So we are well represented, and there will be lots of people ask questions. We've got some planning commission members here too. Mr. Kerr is here. And so what happened was, I'm going to give you a brief kind of history on what's been going on and why we're here, why this is important. The county and the city here are supposed to have consistency between their comprehensive plans, and the purpose of that is that you move from one place to another. We're also close together, and really kind of play the system by being able to get more out of one city than another, and also just because it creates so much confusion with so many communities in one county having different plans and different approaches. And even before it was required by law, specifically for this county, the state required us to try to be consistent with each other's neighbors. So from the beginning, back in 1988, you started a community planning process to meet the new state growth management laws by creating a long-range comprehensive plan, a master plan, we called it. And you contracted, as did most of the small communities in the county, with the Regional Planning Council to help you with that, because of course small towns didn't have planning departments at that time, and most places had a zoning code, but as in the case here, it was being administered by someone else, either the county or eventually for a little while Treasure Island and then back to the county again. But you didn't have enough people working for the city at that point to actually do zoning and land use processes. So the Regional Planning Council came in and gave the small communities a kind of base plan that really just met the state requirements for establishing your land use categories throughout the community, working with you to decide where you want those dividing lines and how intense you wanted each of those to be. And then this community continued planning, which was good. You were supposed to do that. You were supposed to take the year after that to bring your land development regs into compliance with your plan. Go back and adjust your zoning to make sure it was consistent with your land use. And you did that. Your zoning and your land use was really well integrated. The plans weren't updated entirely, the code. As you know, if you're involved with government here, we're always changing the code. You can do that. You should do that. It's kind of a living document that describes not only who you are or were, but where you want to go. And so we changed the codes here, there, and everywhere, and then eventually they start to get a little bit of inconsistency throughout. So we really are at a point where we need to change the whole code again to make sure it's all consistent, but we'll get to that later. Within 4 years of adopting your first plan, you came back with an amendment to specify that Johns Pass was distinctly different than other places, and it needed special regulations or attention. And you designated kind of an overlay designation of activity center on Johns Pass. This was done in 94. And that overlay stayed or kept getting referenced in subsequent changes of land use throughout the community. But underlying that, it was given a general commercial designation. And the floor area ratio with those designations changed and went up over time, partially because initially you would look at it and it didn't look like it was very intense, but if you actually measured out how much building was on top of each lot, you'd realize that it's got quite a bit of a higher floor area ratio. So they started out with, I don't know, I think at 0.7, and then they bumped it up to 0.9, and then over time, by the time you got to the mid-90s, you had really recognized that the strip along Gulf and Johns Pass, and then this downtown area here, the general commercial needed a floor area ratio of about 1.2. That was the estimate. Nobody went through and did the kind of computer digitized calculations we can do now, because that wasn't available then. But that was the floor area ratio that has been on all of your commercial areas all along. The city, or the county, back earlier in their plans, they have a countywide plan that initially just reflected what each of the communities had on their own maps. And we all mapped with the county, so anything we did, we sent over there, and they put it on the map and sent it back. And we always commented on changes to each other's plans. But I can't say that the communication was perfect going back and forth. Obviously, there's gaps. We didn't actually have planning here. There was no planning department for a lot of that time. So when the county would change theirs and they'd send us comments, let us know what was going on, and there may have been nobody here to receive the mail that understood what was being proposed. And so gradually, they changed the county's plan and how they had the city designated without any response back from the city. And by 2015, for sure, and I think it was earlier, but certainly by 2015, the county's plan had designated retail services for the corridor along Gulf Boulevard on the east side and for all of Johns Pass at a 0.55 floor area ratio. Now, generally speaking, what that would give you is a building that's basically one story with maybe a partial second floor on it, but it made if we were to follow that locally, it would make everything in Johns Pass, probably every single building in Johns Pass, non-conforming, and most of the things along Gulf Boulevard as well. Now, the city never changed their own plans to resolve that inconsistency between the two, because the city didn't seem to understand it had happened, but also if you were to go back and do that, you would designate the entire commercial corridor and all of Johns Pass non-conforming, which means that in the case of a large event, a catastrophe, what you'd have to build back would have to meet the new plan of 0.55. You'd lose all your buildings. And what you put back would be something more akin to a McDonald's on various pieces of properties, or gas stations, or 7-Elevens. You could not build back a traditional neighborhood sort of thing you have down on the village. You couldn't actually put back anything along a boardwalk, certainly not Hooters or any of that development. So the only exceptions they have, as a matter of fact, in the 0.55 is you can go higher if you're a hotel. So probably, and you get a PD. So to make the land usable at that and finance development, you would just end up with a lot of really tall hotel towers. And then there's kind of some inconsistencies on how they count those. In hotels, they count garages. In other areas, they don't count garages. So that's not the image that has been approved in all of your plans for how you wanted Madeira Beach to progress. And the things that you wanted to save about Madeira Beach would be destroyed, and you could not put them back. So that's not considered good planning for us. And honestly, it looks as though the county mainly did that as kind of a holding land use category if somebody didn't specifically request something else, because most of the other towns have dealt with that by adopting activity centers for their commercial areas. so they could define differently and allow more of a downtown and a commercial activity than that just straight retail services was giving them. So when we became aware of this, we realized that we really needed to resolve this and not create an inconsistency between those two plans, because we're obligated by law to be consistent with the county's plan. So in order to be consistent with that plan, we need to look at other categories they have that better describe what we've already got built on Gulf Boulevard and what already exists in Johns Pass, and what you anticipate would be open, would bring the openness you need for whatever you plan for the future. Well, land use planning processes always involve community process. So that's why we're here. We have a whole lot of work to do here in Madeira Beach, and there's just more than we could get done by ourselves without some assistance. So we brought in our trusty consulting group here, and they have a lot of experience with this. I'm going to have them go through their observations and reports, and then we'll all be available for questions. After this, we're going to break out in groups. We've got tables set up in the city center room so that people can sit around a table and talk to individuals of us and give us your ideas on what you think the opportunities are, what the concerns you have are, and also make sure you have an opportunity to take our online survey even before you leave today. And we also will have tabs up so that you can make notes and put them on the map and tell us what specific problems you think need to be addressed and where those are. We really do want to get as much of your input as we can, because these are very important decisions to make about preserving what we have and preparing ourselves for the future. Thank you.
Thank you. Good morning. I'm Alan Steinbeck, and I'm with PSG, and I am a land use and transportation planner and working to assist the city. I wanted to highlight some of the things that Linda was saying about process. This meeting was scheduled for 3 hours. We're going to have about an hour of formal togetherness and then more of an open house format for the rest of the morning and through 1 o'clock. So if you're thinking about your day and being here, you can stay as long as you want after we do this. But also, if you know someone who wasn't able to be here now, they can come anytime before 1, and we'll walk them through this and talk to them about it. We do have some cards that we want you to fill out. We will have a little presentation here. We'll do some formal question and answer in this room. And then if you plan to leave this meeting after that question and answer session, we very much want you to fill out a card that looks like this. And those are at the back table there. And this card has an opportunity for you to write down 3 opportunities and 3 concerns you have about this process that you have either as you sit here now or after you hear the presentation. And you'll have an opportunity to do that. So if you're going to walk out the door, please do that now. And also please do take the survey. The information on the survey that Linda mentioned is on the bottom of this card. We very much, though, encourage you to come across the way here to the city center room and talk to us about the maps and give us some additional feedback. You can finish this exercise over there, and we'll have a chance to talk to you one-on-one during that time. So I am going to jump into this presentation here. If you would, please hold your questions and comments until the end, and then we'll have some time to talk to you after this is complete. So Linda mentioned the past planning efforts. There are many in the past that have talked about the nature of Madeira Beach and the fact that there are really 2 major centers and 1 minor center, Crystal Island Neighborhood Center in town. And so we want to make sure that when we're done with this process that we're working on now, that we have the right countywide plan map categories, future land use categories, and zoning to match this. There's some observations that I think are worth noting about Madeira Beach and its importance to the county and its importance to the visitation economy. There's constant survey about people who visit our community here, and Madeira Beach is up here at right in line with Clearwater Beach in terms of the top beach destination that people come to when they visit Pinellas County. So it's a major economic generator and important to the county's economic development, And those visitors are important to your own local economy and your own quality of life as well, because with them comes a lot of options, a lot of things to do, and the ability to maintain this place, which is very unique and a great place to be. More information about this, the Beachgoer Survey has identified the fact, again here, that Madeira Beach is a top visitation destination. But also I think it's important here to look at the reasons why people enjoy this destination and why they make destination decisions. They think about weather when they want to locate somewhere. They think about scenic beauty here. And number 3 is overall ambience and atmosphere, where it's important to me to be at the beach, but it's almost as important to me what's built next to the beach and the community that I'm visiting. And think about for your own selves, when you probably don't vacation at the beach a lot because you live here, but when you go to a place, you think about that overall ambiance and atmosphere. And nothing could be more important to that in how the physical environment is managed through regulation, how development happens, how reinvestment happens, how the community is cared for in terms of its buildings, and how they get reused. And these factors that we're talking about really have an impact on that, and they're important in the maintenance of the community. So land use can be a little bit wonky, it can be a little bit misunderstood, but it really does have an impact on the character, the nature, the economic vitality, and the quality of life of your community in the end. So we've set some goals here for this process that we're doing right now. The first is to update land use policies and development regulations for Johns Pass Village and for Gulf Boulevard to foster desirable redevelopment and reinvestment. As Linda was saying, there's some regulations at the countywide level that are misaligned with the counties, and we're trying to fix that. So we're reestablishing the city's policies as the governing regulations for the area by bringing countywide plan map in aligned with the city's future land use designations and zoning districts. So that's the technical part of the work, and I'll tell you a little bit more about that in a second. And then last is to set density and intensity limits to allow new projects while preserving and enhancing the character, scale, and walkability of Madeira Beach. Most communities who love their community say that we don't want to change. We don't want anything new here. We don't want to be different. The best way to not do that is to stop investment in your community, because if you stop investment in your community, you're very much going to be a different community 10, 20 years from now. We have to have regulations that allow for new investment, revitalization, reuse of properties, and so we don't want regulations that are going to stop that. And right now, there's some risk of that happening the way things are. So to get into the nature of this, for those of you who are unfamiliar, there is a countywide plan that is a land use plan and a growth and development plan for the whole county that covers the whole county, that's maintained by Ford Pinellas and the Board of County Commissioners. And the plan map categories deal with density, intensity, and locational criteria. So they're very general, and they talk about how much development can happen. The city has a comprehensive plan with future land use categories, and those categories have to be consistent with the countywide plan. So the countywide plan is up here in terms of its policy level. The comprehensive plan has to fall within that and be aligned with that. And the Code of Ordinances includes zoning district regulations and other criteria for new development. And that zoning and those regulations are very specific, and those deal with how sites get designed and how buildings are oriented and used. So there's 3 levels of policy that are at play here, and that's unlike most communities, but it does add to the need to think through this carefully and get this work done in collaboration with the county. So in terms of planning terminology, Linda mentioned floor area ratio, and that's sometimes called FAR, and it regulates the maximum floor space that can be constructed on a given piece of land, and it's the ratio between the building and the area of the land. Density usually refers to residential units per acre, and sometimes density and intensity get used to talk about commercial development. But when we talk about floor area ratio, we're typically talking about commercial development. But I do want you to understand and visualize the concept of it if you haven't. A floor area ratio of 0.5 means half the site is covered by a building. A floor area ratio of 1 would mean the whole site is covered by a building, or a 2-story building covers half the site. So that's how the math works out. What we're talking about now is the city having regulations that are in the area of FAR of 1. So you can see the physical relationship. We have a lot of 2, sometimes 3 stories or more buildings in town, and this would be compatible with what's here now. The regulations we're about to tell you about have this FAR of 3.0, but those are those countywide regulations. The city is going to maintain regulations in this zone here. So when you hear us talk about the countywide plan, right now the countywide plan is actually below this number and down in this zone right here. So the countywide plan allows less development than the comprehensive plan of the city does. We're talking about making the countywide plan allow for more, but not changing the city's comprehensive codes at this time. We're not upzoning the community. We're not creating more development potential in the city's comprehensive plan. So that's very important to know. We're trying to deal with the misalignment of these regulations, not create a lot more development. But we are, in fact, as acknowledged, trying to make sure that we have reinvestment and redevelopment of the buildings that are here. I know that may create some uncomfortableness with you, and we're happy to talk about that until 1 o'clock and beyond if you want, but we can do that today. So for example, and if you just drop yourself in any given place in the central part of Pinellas County, these commercial corridors tend to have that FAR of 0.55. If you can imagine that building here taking up about half of the site. So that's how that works. Also, in retail areas and service areas, these kinds of corridors, once you take the road out of there, irrespective of how big it is, the properties on the back are usually in that 0.5 and under 1 floor area ratio category. So that's the kind of development that's currently allowed, but that's not necessarily the kind of development that meets the quality and the experience that we want to have in Mandara Beach. You don't get the same type of character when you do that. So some key points here. There were some compatibility issues that Linda covered in the beginning of the presentation. The countywide plan went down from this 1.2 to 1.55 for retail and services, so basically downgraded what can happen here, and that was a long time ago. We're really not trying to dig up why that happened or who did it or who did what to whom. We're just trying to rectify that now in this work that we're doing. The residential categories also went down as well. So that minor modification created this major discrepancy that we keep referring to about the misalignment of the plan for the county and the city's comprehensive plan. I would say, too, very key here is if as Linda said, something had to go away, it got destroyed in a fire or what have you, it needed to be rebuilt, it couldn't be most of what, let me rephrase that, about a third of what you find on Gulf Boulevard would not be able to be built back like it is because it would have to be built smaller under these rules. So we really want to make sure that people are able to replace in kind what they have and to maintain the character of Johns Pass Village as well. So there's this incompatibility and this risk of not being built, and that pretty much exists all along Gulf Boulevard in cases, and it certainly exists in the Johns Pass Village area where you have a historical pattern of development that can't be replaced under these designations. There are future land use categories, and if you want to learn more about the future land use designations in the city, I do encourage you to come visit us in the room after the meeting, and we'll talk more about that and how that matches up with the countywide plan. So we have two options in front of us, and the city is going to initiate an application to redesignate the countywide plan. And that's going to have a process where we work with Board Pinellas. The Board of County Commissioners are the ones that approve these changes. So the city will be working with other jurisdictions to make this happen, but it will be a city-initiated plan, And our job collectively is to prepare that application and to create the right land use designations to make this work. Right now you have what's called an activity center in the countywide plan, and we're sitting in it at this very moment. And we're talking about creating Johns Pass Village as a similar type of area with similar types of development rights to what you have here. In this first option that we've created, the Gulf Boulevard corridor would be designated as a transit corridor and have very similar development rights, but it would align very well with the countywide plan and its goals for creating transit use, walking and biking, and making walkable communities along the beach. So this proposed activity center, for more detail here, is this hatched area on the map. And it would be the area on the other side of Gulf Boulevard where that would happen. It would designate it as what's called a community center, and it would allow residential units up to 90 units per acre. And this is where there's that oh my gosh moment that happens when you see that. There's the one category available to us. It allows out a lot of amount of density, but the city's underlying future land use allows a lot less than that, only 15 units per acre in this area. So again, the city's regulations would dictate what happens here, but that plan category does have that additional residential density associated with it. The floor area ratio would go from 0.55 to 3.0 in this case. The multimodal corridor would be from just east of the Causeway all the way down to 131st Street on the east of Gulf Boulevard and continue all the way down the beach on the west side of Gulf Boulevard. And that would be changing this designation from retail services and resort to a multimodal corridor, which would allow for a larger mix of uses and also a little bit more development potential. The residential density would go from 24 to 50 units in that case under the countywide rules. So the overall strategy here is to have activity centers on both end of town connected by a multimodal corridor where development looks like it is or very similar as it is today to support walking, transit use, and that sort of thing. The second option we're thinking about doing is having the whole corridor designated as an activity center and just having everything under that one designation under the countywide rules. And that is maybe an easier thing to do, but it also doesn't align as well with the county's goals of having transit supportive development that connects activity centers. And but it does come with very similar regulations with it as well. So the zoning map, again, I showed you you were just looking at the countywide rules. There's the comprehensive plan's future land use categories, and then that lower tier, that more detailed tier of regulation is the zoning map. And we have some of this information across the way, but it is used for regulation and protection of property. So it's the most limiting of any of those threes, and it has a lot more detail in it than those other types of regulations. And so getting this right is actually the most important thing for the city, and that's something that's completely under the city's control once we resolve these issues with the countywide plan. So you're going to hear a couple of words if you start talking to us. The activity centers are these central places in the county. They have different types of them within the countywide rules. We're requesting the third most intense type, this community center. So we're not becoming like the other major places in the county that you might be wondering about. Those have a much higher designation of future land use. We're down here in where I think we should be in our lane as a community of having this community center designation. For the transit corridors, again, there's very high level visions for developing transit corridors in the county, and we're down here again at this third level of designation. So we're not supersizing these development rights. We're actually calibrating them to where they need to be for Madeira Beach. And I want to show you one thing from the countywide plan. The countywide plan includes a land use strategy map, and the countywide plan emphasizes the link between transportation and land use and making transportation investments and development decisions. They have designated most of the major corridors in the county as one type of future transit corridor or another. And our Gulf Boulevard here is a secondary corridor. Again, not one of the top two primary corridors, but the third tier of transit corridor, which is aligned with the type of land use that we are asking to go with it. So it makes sense from a policy perspective to do this kind of approach, and the countywide plan promotes that. And just by way of example, there are some many other communities that have this activity center designation in them. We thought one good example of that would be Gulfport, where they do have a historic downtown and a historic center. It's also classified at that community center level, which is the same level that we're proposing for Madeira Beach. It has a traditional style of development patterns in its core, and it has limited on-site parking and very small pieces of property. So it's a good doppelganger example community, but it also gives you a sense of the types of development and the other types of places that have the same kind of future land use associated with it. So in conclusion, this is a vital tourist destination, and for the city's own sake, keeping that way is important for the local economy, and this will help us do that. The retail and services category that's in the land use is not compatible with our existing land uses or future development, and so we're trying to really make things compatible with the kind of place that Madeira Beach is, and to be able to sustain that over time. And then we want to make the land uses allow for future redevelopment, and also allow for things like having buildings where the parking is not on the site, but in other places, which this helps us do. So with that, I'm going to stop talking for a few minutes, and we're going to deal with any questions you might have. We'll have some formal questions. Please, if you have a comment or concern, I encourage you to write it down and come tell us about it in the after meeting. But right now, I'm hoping we can deal with people's curiosities about anything that we've said, what the process is, what the desired outcomes are, and we can take some questions now. So. We do have another microphone somewhere. Yes, so the city is trying to record the meeting, so hearing from you is important. So if you would please take the microphone when you talk.
Perfect. My name is Leslie Smith. I live on Crystal Island, and the question I have is, if the goal is compatibility, why are we trying to increase the county's FAR over what the city currently has? Why do we need to go from 1.2 all the way to 3? Because as you know, with anything, as soon as there's a higher limit somewhere, you're going to be requesting variances, and people are going to push for that higher limit. So we could be compatible without going to 3. I guess that's my question.
Well, there is no other category that gets that 1.2 FAR that's in the city's comprehensive plan. So there isn't a like-kind countywide future land use category that matches up with the city's future land use categories in the comprehensive plan. This activity center designation and this transit corridor are the closest there are. So it does create this additional amount of development rights according to the county's plan. But again, we're not suggesting changing the comprehensive plan's regulations, which is what would regulate decisions in the city into the future. We've been allowed to do that because this issue hasn't been resolved, but we need to resolve the issue so that we can get everything back in line so that the city does have that sort of discernment available to it, rather than having the countywide rules be actually more limiting than what the city has. So, yes, Linda wants to say something.
What we can do within the activity centers is zone areas and put overlays on them that regulate further under the 3. And one of the reasons we went to the 3 instead of the 2 is we actually have buildings that even the comp plan, our own plan, doesn't adequately cover. There are several buildings throughout along Gulf Boulevard and through the village that are over 1.2 anyway. Sometimes things were built, and then, like I said, when they established the one, they started at like a 7, and they thought the 7's not right, and they went to 9, then they jumped to 1.2, and the reason they jumped to 1.2 was at that point, that was a floor area ratio that was allowed in the county plan, not because it directly covered what was already there. They were using the highest commercial that was available and consistent with the old county plan for general commercial. But they never went back, counted all the floor area, and realized that even that wasn't counting the way that Johns Pass was already developed. So when you look at Johns Pass, you see all those buildings side by side down there along Village Boulevard. Those are all two-story buildings, or most of them are two-story buildings, and they almost entirely cover their lot, which means they're already potentially right at 2.0 instead of 1.2. Or they may be, you could see when you go down there, you've got a lot of the ground covered in part of the second floor. So some of them are a little bit under 1.2, some are a little bit over. The combination of things at Hooters in the garage down there and that is right at a 2.0, potentially over. And along Gulf Boulevard, we also have many things that are actually over the 1.2 that we have now. So we were proposing that because we want to get to a point we have a land use that at least covers everything we've got, remembering that we have two options below that to designate. That is, we can have zones down here in this area where they've put the activity center, the same kind of activity center. We have corridor designated areas that can have this particular combination of units and floor area, and then there's other areas that have other designations. So that's what that's why we want you writing all this detail down. I don't think anybody would like to propose, at least like openly, that they would want someone to come in and put a massive development over top of where we have Village Boulevard now. That's very important to our identity. It's important to the people who come here that ambiance and that type of development is here. But so what we need to do is decide within the Johns Pass Village, where are those areas and what are they supposed to look like? How much do we think should be along the coast where we've still got commercial fishing going on, and we want to support that kind of activity. That's important, charter fishing and all the water activities. You don't want to block all that off for single uses either. So we need to talk about within that district exactly how much development belongs in what areas. We also have included in that hatched marked area Pelican Lane, because Pelican Lane was never included as part of the area, but they suffer all the impacts of being part of Johns Pass Village, but don't really have any protections for that. So we need to decide what kind of development really would work or could be supported along there, looking at the back end of the village, and what kind of density or what height is appropriate there. What kind of protections do we need to put in place? Other things like the conditions of the roadway will weigh into this. We'll need policies that say, even if you come in with a bigger building, before you can build something, you're going to have to either show that the roads and the storm sewers and everything else can actually support that, or you're going to have to replace them, because all of those streets back there were built as local streets. They don't have the standards of construction you would put in a high-intensity commercial area. So if you're going to have big buildings, if it's got to be supported by big trucks, then you need to know ahead of time the roads are going to make it through that. And then you can have in the zoning, we can have other overlay credentials, like what time can deliveries be made, what size of trucks are allowed in this district. We can establish very specific controls in there to keep it at the function that you think is appropriate for this community. So we really want to get your input on all of those things.
Linda?
Yes.
Louder than I thought, sorry.
Yes.
I remember when I first came to Madeira Beach and the first seafood festival I was at, that Friday night we had a torrential downpour, and we actually had a funnel cloud that came in over Johns Pass, and unfortunate for Seminole, it landed in a trailer park over in Seminole, but you know, it could have very easily have touched down into Johns Pass Village. And if we lose the buildings that are there now, what you're explaining is that we could not rebuild those buildings under the current conditions that we have by way of the comprehensive plan now. Is that correct?
That's correct. And even if the buildings, in some areas, if the buildings were within the 1.2 that we have now, we don't have anything in our plan talking about design and how we know what areas within that you think should be more traditional or more pedestrian oriented. There's nothing in our codes right now to protect even what we have, so we really need to address those issues. Yes.
Good morning. Teresa Nelson. I live on 140th Avenue. I believe that one of you made a statement that hotels can go to a higher FAR. Is this a higher FAR than the 3.0?
It's actually in the county's plan. The county's plan, where they have the .55, allows for you to come in with a PD for a hotel and go much higher. Like, I think it goes to as high, where's Andrew, as high as at least 4.0, which would result in really high stacked type buildings, but the rest of it being very low grade.
So the proposals that are on the table that have 3.0 FARs for both the Gulf Boulevard corridor as well as the activity center at Johns Pass are limited to 3.0. There's no exception
right
out there from a
right.
city standpoint.
Correct. That's one of the reasons that doesn't work very well. Because what it does is it encourages you to make, of course, if you own property commercially, you want to make the very best of it. You're obviously going to come in with a PD and build all hotels. There's no merit and no reward for building something small, so it incentivizes all the PDs. The other thing it does is similar to the way we're dealing with things right now. Our code right now is very restrictive to height, and so everyone who comes in with a development comes in and has to ask for a planned development. Everything is specially regulated and has to go through the city commission. There's no such thing as being able to just use your development plan, because especially in today's economy, it's very hard to come in with a two-story building and get financing for it, especially since we don't use much of the ground floor, or you have to flood-proof it in order to use it, so it's a very expensive building.
Right.
So
that's probably a good
yeah.
segue to
right.
jump into the elephant in the room
Mm-hmm.
And talk about maximum stories, because clearly, you know, maybe others routinely work within the terminology of FAR, but I don't, and but I'm going to catch on quick.
Right.
And you know, so clearly you can look at the formula and understand
Mm-hmm.
that there's potential to go high as long as your coverage of your maximum land is commensurate with
Correct.
that. So,
Correct.
you know, clearly that has trade-offs. If we took a one-story that's completely covering the land and we're able to make permeable surface out of part of it, and they go up to 2 or 3 stories. But I think there's a little disconnect between statements that say we want to preserve the character of the community, and yet we're talking in terms of FAR. So I think we need to really get those two things to coincide with one another.
And there's 2 ways that you can define FAR. Sometimes, for instance, in the county's plan, in some areas, hotels have to include their garage space in the FAR, but none of the other uses have to do that. And that would, so if you're counting every single floor, including the garage, you can't get very high with 3. But if you're not if you're adding extra floors of garage in that, then it can stack up a lot higher, sure. And that goes to show, you know, how you start out in a land use plan with this very general concept of what the floor area ratio is, the real intensity of it, but there are other things in the districting and in the zoning where you need to follow through all the way through with what is your policy intent, what's your design intent. And we've never, well, when you went through the Dewani Plater-Zyber process back in 2002, the community was very involved in that, on development of that plan, and that came out with a whole book of standards that talked about exactly that. What's your design intent? How intense do you really want it to get by height? And but then the city never adopted any of that. So we have begun with that as our planning process, and also going back through all the old plans and seeing what was the strain of discussion. There are other policies that the city has always had and carried through on its plan that talked about its nautical beach, history and its sense of identity and what style of buildings, and it wanted to be accessible and family-oriented. It wasn't going towards this massive commercial identity in the high buildings and things like that. And it comes up regularly. The commissioners hear it all the time. We don't want to be Clearwater Beach, and so that's the sort of thing we need to get down, because you can have some of those regulations and place them into the plans we're talking about. If you're looking at 3, but you don't want it to be massive, what kind of height limits, you can put height limits in the comp plan. It makes it very inflexible later, so you'd want it to be high enough that you have some flexibility to make decisions as time went by, but you can do some of that sort of thing in your design work and your districting as well.
Okay. And I don't want to monopolize, but I do want to make a comment that on 140th, the storm drains already overflow, so anything that creates more impermeable surface there is problematic. I got flooded in our little hurricane that we had. And the other thing, and I'll talk about this later, is that the survey, first quarter 2021, I don't know if there are prior surveys of what the population is, but I believe it's clear that, one, it may not be a good sample, and first quarter 2020 is an anomaly due to COVID.
Okay, thank you.
I was going to...
Beerman, Bocasiega Drive. I'm really taken aback how dangerous we've been living and how lucky we are. And I never quite thought that the city was working on luck, rather than the right information. My question really is, how long can we go on without fixing this? Is there an immediate way of handling the hurricane season coming in, and we are still very vulnerable and open? And you know how everybody has an opinion, and this could take years with everybody talking about what to do. Can we fix this at the moment and make it better as we go along, or are we just hanging in there hoping luck will stay with us?
There is a defined process. It does take some time to get through because it involves your city commission. It involves the Fort Pinellas and the county commission as well. So there's about a 6-month process just if everything went perfectly from where we sit right here today to get through all of those because there's public hearings involved, there's notices, there's other things that have to happen. So
no way that we can put a blanket on us for a while we're trying to fix this the right way, because it will not take 6 months. We know we're going to be longer. And the hurricane and all the good stuff is happening. Is there any way we can make an adjustment for now and then fix it?
there's no regulatory quick fix. I've never heard of one. But if there were some kind of event that happened that had some widespread damage associated with it or anything like that, I am pretty sure in the wake of that there would be some good faith efforts to try to get people the development rights they needed to build back in kind. That sort of thing is possible, and that would also take a little while, but so does recovery from an event like that. So I feel like we could do that.
Technically, our comp plan still regulates activity here. The question would be, would we be sued for using it? Because it was inconsistent with what the county had. So it would really be a conflict that would happen kind of above and outside of the process of restoration. We do have policies in our comprehensive plan also, or actually within our code, that allow you to put back in kind what you have in density and intensity, as long as it's something that occurred due to a natural disaster. And we have done that in some places, fortunately, because a good example of that is the little apartment complex on 129th. Irma took the back end of that off many years ago, and it's been in the process of negotiation with insurance agents and valuations at the county ever since then. This is almost 4 years, right? And one of the things that was important was the sequence they went through things, and I worked with them throughout this because I had advised that they come back through our process and get established as having been damaged in that emergency event, that declared emergency, so that they could get the same density back, because the current density for that lot would only have given them 2 units back instead of an apartment complex. And obviously there wasn't going to be any investment advantage to their doing that. That was one of the things that took so long about getting the building taken down, was making sure that they did everything properly and got reestablished for their old density so they could put in a little apartment complex back.
Hi, Leslie Smith again. I have one comment and one question. So the comment I have is I feel like there's been a little bit of inconsistency about what the actual damage would be. Originally, we heard that all of the buildings on Gulf Boulevard and in Johns Pass wouldn't be able to be rebuilt, and then we heard that really it's only a third that are non-conforming. So 2/3 of what exists today could be rebuilt, and for the other third, there are other avenues to pursue. And I'm not saying there's not risk, but I'm just saying there are other alternatives to changing our guidelines. But my question is, the 2002 plan, one of the missions for the city was to create a pedestrian-friendly corridor along Gulf Boulevard. My question is, how does increasing development along the beach without adequate parking create a pedestrian-friendly corridor when people are walking across the street, mostly drunk?
Okay. If you remember going through the 2002 plan, you remember that one of the important things about creating a pedestrian activity or atmosphere is there's a connection or a proximity between buildings. So if you're walking past something, it looks interesting, but then you have to go past 25, 30 yards worth of parking to get to the next one. You're not as inclined to just be drawn down the street. And it becomes more hostile, because then you've got people pulling directly into parking, to all these curb, breaks along the street. So the idea is to create more of a line of buildings to turn the sidewalk into a space. It feels like it's a place of its own. And in there, we've got some areas where things are kind of close together, and others where it's the old style of development with a whole lot of break and parking. At some point, the city had adopted a parking code, and that parking code was based on pretty old standards. It shows up in the code actually in more than one place parking does. And since I've been here, we've amended it 3 or 4 times, trying to make it work for some of the issues. But one of the things that really does need to be done is that we need a new parking code that more appropriately addresses the type of business and the densities that we have here, the way parking is used. We also have the added complexity of having buildings up higher when they come back in to develop, and trying to encourage people as they come with a new building, like if they were going to put in a little apartment complex or a small hotel along there on some of those smaller lots, that they would not just use the ground floor as just parking, because that is not pedestrian oriented. It doesn't draw people down the street at all. And it does still continue to give those curb cuts where people are driving directly in. So we've been trying to work with everybody, encouraging them to do flood proofing if they're going to rebuild on the ground floor, so that they can have commercial there. It's something for people to do that they can get to by walking. and it doesn't require you to get in your car to move from one place to another. But also, the parking is a significant issue throughout the community. It really is, because we get people coming in who from all over the county or all over the region, and of course they're driving in, and not knowing their way around. If they get down here and they can't see that it's connected and there's a comfortable place to park and then walk, they're going to keep getting in the cars and going from one thing to another. Those are really very significant issues. We need more parking, and we need better placed parking. So we're wrestling with that all the time when we do regulation. Right now we have to use the codes as they are. We have been amending the codes and wanting to do the entire code altogether, but as of 2017, when I came here, I was the planning department, and I had a part-time assistant, administrative assistant, but there were no other planners. In the meantime, we've had to update the CRS for your insurance reductions through FEMA. We've had the flood that took everything offline really for like 3 months at least, while we tried to get help for all the people who had water in their buildings. And so there's always something interrupting. We've been trying to put together enough people to deal with the comp plan, this activity center issue we discovered, and all of the other things that are now required for planning. It does take time. And to your point, land use is very long, drawn-out process, because it does have to go through us. In our case, in Pinellas County, we have to require the county to adopt their plan as well. So it's kind of a dual plan amendment. And then it still has to go to the state as well, and there's hearing time frames and all of that. So your point is well taken. I think that when we do surveys, parking is always the issue on top. But just changing the codes is not going to really resolve our problem, because a lot of times if you make it, right now, for instance, even with the current parking, if somebody comes in and they want to improve their building, and it may be vacant even, and they want to put a new use in, if that use demands more parking than the last use, we can't even let them do the improvement. So by not having enough parking, you can actually cripple yourself. You get to the point where nobody's allowed to fix or improve or bring new uses in. You can't change the uses out. It's so restrictive that the economy can't survive that. So that's a really important part of what we have to do, is think about how do we get into them. The other thing is that in Johns Pass and down here in this activity center, over the years they had decided to do special parking districts, which actually just cut the parking requirement in half. So we actually know ahead of time we don't have enough parking per use. The idea behind that was that people will just park one time for several uses, and it's shared parking. But we don't have a lot of shared parking. So usually when you do that after you've got a garage, not in the hopes that it'll develop one. So we're kind of behind, maybe the cart before the horse there. This gentleman's had a question for a while.
Tom Edwards, Gulf Lane. So you brought up about the Dewani plan.
Mm-hmm.
They had a number of charrettes. We had hundreds of residents attend those charrettes, and they came up with a very good plan.
Yes.
How is that plan? Does it meet the county plan, or how slightly off is that? Because we spent $250,000 on that.
Yes, you did.
So where are we with that?
Yes. Well, that's why we wanted to get it out and use it as the base, because another question. So the Dewani's plan was more of, it's not really a land use plan, it's more of a regulatory zoning district overlay. So it doesn't have the densities and intensities of use that we have to put in our comp plan to provide for that kind of development. Those plans actually end up really intense in terms of the number of square feet and the density you get. For instance, you look places, even old places like Savannah. If you go to Savannah, it's so enjoyable. You can walk down all the streets, and there's commercial and residential and everything mixed together. They aren't really that intense in terms of height. You know, you have mostly 2- and 3-story buildings, but in their cases, everything's zero lot line, it's side by side, they share walls all over town to get to that lower development. And here, previously in your plans, even when Duane was here, it was a bit of an issue, is that you're, and I hear this all the time, yeah, but we need to leave spaces so that we can see past through the water. When you do that, it spreads everything out, and it usually results in higher buildings because you want more setback on the lot. So we do need to deal with the kind of two different concepts on how the buildings go together and how the streets get built, because their proposal would have been side-by-side buildings without those spaces, and they would have gotten quite a bit of intensity out of it. They also asked you to pull all the buildings forward to the sidewalk. They use more of the lot and put the parking in back. So you would have one driveway and people would get around the back to park. In our case, a lot of it, like along Golf, the back is the water. And so sometimes people want the view out the water, not the parking. And they prefer to have the cars on the street and the view in the back. So there are some complexities to using those concepts in different settings. The Duane settings are usually have a street between them and the water. For instance, on Pelican, what he had suggested is swapping out where the single family and the vacant lots are on Pelican for where the street is, so that all the residents and those associated commercial buildings would be back to back with the village commercial, and they'd share an alley. And then you could put like the old brick street out in front of it and look across that street to your docks, kind of like down in Coffee Pot Bayou approach. That was in the Duane plan. Those kind of things cost a lot of money. You're tearing up streets, removing all, and changing out facilities. It requires the cooperation of all those individual property owners. I mean, it would look great, but it is a really big investment, and it requires quite a bit of coordination. So there are spots in it where also the way it was developed down here would have been a number of smaller streets with low buildings on the ground. He saw offices on the ground everywhere here, and kind of like a two-story, very intense development through this area. They hadn't had the fields planned. It would have replaced the Winn-Dixie, which, you know, at some point in the future I'm sure will happen, but with a different kind of smaller retail type development. If you look at the plans, it's not the way they ended up developing here with this campus feel. It also, typically, Duane's plans don't include floodplain requirements. They don't anticipate that because that's not their thing. And we have to build everything up, or you got to flood-proof it on the bottom. So it costs a lot more to do that here than it would on the mainland somewhere. Those are all little complexities that you can't necessarily take it and use it to create your land use. You have to kind of figure out what land use in terms of overall intensity you want, and then use as much of that as we can, or those principles, to create the overlying districts and the land development code that will regulate those areas.
Just a quick.
In terms of implementing a Duane-like plan, it's going to be somewhere like 20% of that would be a function of the comprehensive plan, and 80% of that would be a function of zoning and land development regulations. So if you remember these three levels of plans: county, comprehensive plan of the city, and then land development regulations, you really have to deal with those in a somewhat linear fashion, because the comprehensive plan is supposed to be aligned with the county plan, and the zoning and the land development regulations are supposed to implement the comprehensive plan. So if the city needs to make fixes to the countywide plan, we really kind of have to start there, then go to the comp plan, and then go to the zoning. And that stuff can be done concurrently, but we're really just trying to deal with the first step of that, which is to get the countywide plan to a place where we can then move on to doing the updates that Linda was describing earlier and just now.
Just one quick comment and one short question. Everyone says, well, you can build higher and you're going to have more space between buildings and you can see the water. That's never happened. So, I mean, you drive along Gulf Boulevard, you're not going to see the Gulf because the sea oats, you got 12-story buildings at 150th. They got a ramp going up to their second parking garage. You're not going to see it. So, you know, that's a fallacy they keep pushing for. The other question is you probably talked to the county, so we've got 24 cities, communities in Pinellas. How far off are their comp plans where they're not meeting the county compared to ours? You know, are we just you know, 20% off, 50% off, or what are the other communities doing? I mean, you brought up Gulfport.
Right. I don't know of any other examples like this, but you would know better.
We've been going through it a little bit because we expect to have broader conversations when we go through the county's discussions with them. Most of the other governments knew when those changes were proposed, especially the bigger governments. They're very much more involved. They have big staffs. And they changed and went to these higher designations of activity centers when the county was changing their plan, instead of this getting the leftover land use of retail services. So almost all of the major commercial centers in the county have an activity center of some kind or another. Now, they do have those, like the car lot areas that are out on the highways. Those have the retail services, but you know how big those are, big lots full of cars and parking, and then smaller buildings. Those worked okay with the retail services, but in any kind of an urban intensity of downtown or any kind of walking area, they went to an activity center. We do know of some areas that have this designation, just like ours, that are not in compliant. We're concerned about that, and we're trying to look at some of the really little governments who still don't have planning departments or have one person there trying to handle it, especially out here on the islands, to make sure they know what they've got, and if they do need to make changes, let them know about it too. So we know there are some places, like maybe in the Reddingtons, where things were built actually a little more intense than the designation would have allowed on the county plan, but it is consistent with their own plan. But we haven't counted up all the floor area ratio. St. Pete Beach actually designated almost the whole of the city as an activity center, all the way down the corridor. It's just one big activity center. That's how they dealt with it. And Treasure Island has a big area designated for activity center because of this.
Now, I would add too that the administrative burden of, in terms of other communities and other cities, municipalities, going through the process of demonstrating compliance with the countywide plan, it is an additional administrative burden that's on Pinellas County's municipalities. But when there's misalignment, it's even that much more difficult. So getting this sorted out will help the city have a better chance of being more efficient and making decisions and getting things done here at the local level too. I do want to, I don't want to get people to get fatigued of this format, because I want you to reserve some energy for going next door and talking to us directly. But if there's a couple, maybe one or two other burning questions, we can do that now. Yes, sir.
Eric Cabrera, Miramar Avenue in North Bayshore. I was concerned you guys keep talking about the maintaining the character and the feel of the town, yet, I hear rumors about the Schooner Hotel is going to be, they're proposing to build a 7 to 9 story building with that doesn't feel like keeping the character of the town. And it's the same people that built the Cambria Hotel, so it's going to be in that style, very commercial, industrial-like feel. It doesn't have a beachy, Madeira Beach feel, I believe. I want to know, what is the truth about what is going to be going on with the Schooner Hotel?
We're having hearings on the Schooner Hotel, and this is a very timely question. It is on the agenda in part on the coming meeting on the 9th. They will open the hearing and then have to continue part of it, but that's a great time to come in and talk about that, because the commission will be opening discussions and input on the development agreement. When the project first came in, it was kind of a hotel on two sides of the road, and on the beach side was to be 5 stories. They came back with a new plan that put the other 2 stories over on the beach side. Those stories in that height, I think it comes to 7 now of floors, but it's over. That includes the parking floors, and if you go down that side of golf, it's kind of hard to argue that's not in compliance with the rest of that side of golf, because there are a lot of the condos, the median height of the condos is actually 7 stories. But there are a lot of buildings along that are tall. There are a lot of buildings that are very small. And that's for the community to decide, because that's a planned development. And the only way to get that height is to come through and be approved as a PD. So it's a good time to come in. There'll be more discussions on it as well. And with the PDs, you know, the commission has a lot of say and input. The community has a lot of input, actually, into style. And the more recent versions, well, they originally came in with a very ornate Mediterranean. Some people really liked it. Other people were giving comments that it was kind of out of sync, too much design. And so they came back with something that was really simple and just basically more of a massing, not to show what exactly the design was going to be. And the commission was kind of lukewarm on it. They wanted some more detail on design. So with a PD, the community can dictate design more. And they are coming back with another style that I've got a glimpse of. They're wanting to make a big presentation with it, but they're coming back. And the commission's going to make a lot of input, and they'll be taking public hearing on that as well. So they can be told what it should look like, definitely.
Chuck Dillon, William Drive. Aridom is, according to the plans, the building right next door, that's 57 feet tall. The new building is intended to be over 100 feet tall. And all of those condos on Gulf Boulevard are basically 5 stories over a parking.
I would like to ask that you would come back with all these details and talk about them at that hearing, because this is a quasi-judicial process in the commission. We have commissioners here. They're really not supposed to be talking about anything other than what's already been heard. That's why I just addressed where we are in the process and the old stuff. But definitely come to the hearings on those. And we have been publishing everything and advertising it and doing notices, and we'll be doing more notices in the future as well. So every time you have the opportunity,
Off that subject also, am I understanding that you're going to try to do a plan, community plan for the future of what everything's going to be going on in Madeira Beach and updating the codes?
Yes, that would follow this. This comprehensive planning process gives us the base, the ground rules of how intense, but we're going to be coming back in and doing even more detailed surveys and more of a design approach to what we want everything to look like in the future, how we want the streets to interact, people with the buildings and the streets with the buildings, and what kind of spaces are being created. And can give you more detail that time too, how that interfaces with our floodplain requirements, and also what kind of cost there is to that style of development, and what the community gets back out of it, because you have to understand what all those relationships are to make good long-term decisions.
So with that in mind, do you have a ballpark of how long you think this is going to take? Is it going to be a 6-month process, a year process?
Well, the land use process takes at least 6 months, unfortunately, but we have all these state-mandated hearing processes and review timeframes to go with. What we plan to do is to turn in the land use plan. Once we get past the county, it'll go up to the state. We want, after we've got that going, to start the next process that gets the detail on the zoning. What do we want the districts to look like? That can go faster because it's local only and would be consistent with whatever the land use is going to propose. So we would hope that within a couple months after that to have all that. It'd be nice if we could get it done all at the same time, but to during the year have all of that done, with the understanding that we also have to upgrade our entire comp plan. The rest of this year we've really been set back by COVID because those require community hearings and input, and that's why if you've been watching the commission, they've been having hearings on impact fees, and when they brought in the impact fees, we upgraded the comp plan elements that went with it to try to double up that process. But there are some other elements, coastal elements we need to talk about, housing, and just some other bits and pieces of your comp plan. That has to be adopted by May of '22. So we're going to actually have to do all of this at the same time. You're going to spend a lot of time here.
And then finally, the two options that you were talking about, so it's either option 1 or option 2 as far as a big plan, and that's going to be devised with community input.
Yes, like we're getting today, and like we're about to go do in the room across the way. And there will be there is a required public hearing as well, a formal process associated with that. So since it's city initiated, the city's taking these steps now to do this, which is not a required part of the process, but there'll be another chance at a public hearing to weigh in on it in a formal way. This is intended to be informal and sort of an anything goes kind of curiosity and feedback session. But and again, we're just talking about the countywide rules and just that first part of the work that's happening right now.
Quickly, I'd like to address a couple of points with public input. I know your jobs aren't easy, so please take these in the vein that they're meant to ensure that all parties, business and residential, get input. So the mailings, I'm not sure what kind of mailing list is used, but I have friends who did receive a letter, and I did not. So I found out through them, even though I am a property owner. And also, I would double check that. There was an error in the URL for the survey. And then the survey, if I recall correctly, did not provide options to select below 3 stories, which is sort of a self-determining way of performing a survey, and I think pretty inappropriate. I felt like I needed to take the survey, but I'm a little reluctant and kind of want to pull it back because it didn't give me an option for 2 stories where so much of what currently is there is 1 story. And 3 stories might be okay in the future, but the fact is that you've collected data that was limited in the beginning. And so, really need to make sure that when studies and data are prepared, that they're appropriate and not misrepresenting.
Okay. And I would like to know if you could give us, anybody who didn't get a mailed notice, please let us know, because we use the property appraiser's files. And so there may be, that's probably it. Yeah, it's really hard for us to know if how far behind they may be. And so by all means, let us know what your address is so we can keep in touch with you if you're signed in, or an email is great, because we will email people too and create lists for that. In regards to the survey, the reason for that is because we were talking about whole districts, and where 1 or 2-story buildings may be all that you have on one street in that district, a 2-story regulation wouldn't have covered what was already there. So that's why we have to come back with sub-districts under that to restrict if there are places that you only want 1. Also keeping in mind, 1-story isn't actually legal unless you flood-proof the whole thing. So because we're on a barrier island, we know that most things are going to end up 2-story, or they really aren't probably going to function. And it's certainly hard to finance. Anything with residential cannot be on the ground floor. So.
Okay, I think, are we ready to move across the hall? I really appreciate everybody coming out today, and hopefully you have the extra time, being on a Saturday, and it's a gorgeous day, but hopefully you can still spend some time with us and give your opinions, your feedback, fill out some of those cards, because all of that public input is very important to us. So we really, I thank everybody for coming. If you want to take a little bit of a break, we do have restrooms that are through the doors here on the right-hand side, and right across the hall over here to my left is the City Center room, and we'll have some of our staff there to help you and also answer your questions. Alan?
Thank you very much for your time. Look forward to talking to you further.